This is a big claim, but there's a photo editing technique that literally changed my life. Before I discovered it, my landscapes were amateurish at best and downright overcooked at worst. But since then, I got good at using it and teaching it to others. And over the past 12 years, I've helped thousands of photographers take their landscape editing to the next level using this technique. So in this video, I'll show you what this game-changing editing technique is, how you can use it to improve the quality of your landscapes in less than 5 minutes, and I'll show you where to download the free Photoshop plugin that I made that makes it easier to do than ever. First, let me show you one of the biggest quality crushing editing problems that this technique solves, and then how to easily solve it. Something that you might find yourself wanting to do with a shot like this, where we have very dark objects, is you might want to brighten them up. So adding a curves adjustment layer, what you can do is brighten the image with the curve, taking notice of how much it's actually brightening the island itself and kind of discarding what it's doing to the other stuff. And then you would normally invert the layer mask, so Control or Command I is going to turn the layer mask black and hide that adjustment. And then what you would do is take the brush tool with a white foreground color. I like to use about 30% opacity, and then brush that lightness into the image by painting that white brush into the black layer mask. So let's do that. And try and get right up to the edges, and you might already be seeing the negative side of what's happening here. So we have the island is being lit, it's getting brighter, and that's what we want. But look around the outside edge. We're getting a massive halo, and that's because it's basically impossible to get right up to the edge without going over the edge. Now, what you really want is for those brushstrokes to be so accurate that you can toggle your adjustment off and on and see absolutely no halo. So let me show you how to do that using the luminosity masking plugin that you can get for free in the link in the description and pinned comment. So let me just reset that layer mask, and what I'll do is just from this luminosity selections bar here, I'm going to click the -5 button, which is going to load a selection which is going to act as a stencil for us to brush through into the layer mask. So a -5 on this bar here means that it's going to load a selection of the darkest shadows. So there we go. So with that selection active, I'll again click on the black layer mask. With my white brush, I'm now going to paint into the mask and reveal that brightening curves adjustment layer. And check this out, I'm going right over the edges of the island there. But if I deselect the selection now so you can see what's happened, we can see there's absolutely no spillover into the sky, no halo at all. So making these accurate adjustments along the edges of things is super powerful, but what if there was a way to make adjustments to, say, the shadows, midtones, or highlights without even having to brush anything? Well, great news, there is. Let me show you how it works. Adding contrast to the midtones of an image is something that can really make it pop. Now, one way that you could do that using the method that I just showed you would be to add a curves adjustment, create your contrast. So an S-curve is a good example there of an adjustment that's going to add contrast. And then what we could do is, instead of using a white brush to brush in this effect like we did in the last example, we can use a black brush to now brush it out of the dark shadows and the bright highlights. And we would do that by first making a selection for the shadows, grabbing our brush and then brushing it out using the shadows stencil to restrict the brushstrokes to the shadows. And then we would do the same thing for the highlights. So in the top end of the bar, in the positive numbers, we got highlight selections, so we could select the highlights and use the black brush to mask it out from the highlights. And the result of that is that what's left is contrast adjustments in the midtones. However, as easy as that is, we can do it in even fewer steps. So let me show you how. Now what we need to do, under this curves shortcut section just below the luminosity selections bar, where we have the add contrast button, just to the right of that we've got 3 more buttons that are going to allow us to add contrast to either the shadows, midtones, or highlights. That's what those 3 abbreviations mean: shadows, midtones, highlights. So add contrast in the midtones, we click this MI button here, and it's going to add a curves adjustment with an S-curve that we can adjust still if we want to add more contrast, but it's going to have a luminosity mask applied to it automatically that's restricting this curves adjustment just to the midtones. So now I can increase the contrast. I can really create quite a drastic S-curve there. And we can see we're adding a lot of contrast in the midtones, and the highlights and the shadows are being protected by that luminosity mask. And we can see how much protection that's adding if I disable the mask with a shift click on the mask there. So look at that. That is way over contrasty. The shadows are completely black. The highlights are completely overexposed. But with that one click mask, we're able to add contrast in the midtones only, like this. Now, as you may have guessed, with these other options, you've probably spotted them already. We've got add contrast, brighten, and darken. And each one of those has got a button next to it that allows you to add each one of those to either the shadows, midtones, or highlights. So in the same way as we just added contrast to the midtones, we might decide that we want to brighten the shadows. So let's do that in one click, like so. And now the luminosity mask has been applied to a curves adjustment, which again you can double click to open and adjust further. And we are brightening the shadows without brightening the highlights. Now if we wanted to darken the highlights, just for example, we would go to the darken row, select the HL button for highlights, and now we're darkening the bright half. So these buttons are useful shortcuts to some powerful adjustments, but sometimes they won't go as far as you need. So what do I mean by that? The shadows buttons give you an adjustment isolated to basically the dark half of the image, and the highlight buttons do the same for the light half. But what if you want to isolate only the very darkest shadows and not just the dark half of the image in a single click? Well, you can do that too with the plugin, so let me show you how. So let's take this most recent adjustment that we added, this darken highlights. What if that's actually darkening too much? We don't want it to darken that much of the histogram. So let's say we only want it to darken the very brightest highlights, which is probably going to be some of the brighter parts of the water and definitely the sky up here and lighter parts of the cloud up here. Well, the good news is it only takes one more click, and it just comes down to understanding how this luminosity selections bar works. Now, on the positive side, in the positive numbers, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 1 button is going to give you the exact same selection as the highlights button on in any of these. So essentially the light half of the image. If you want to isolate only the very, very brightest pixels, so literally like the very top end of the histogram, then you're going to pick 5. So for example, if we wanted to make a darkening adjustment to only the very brightest highlights, we would click the 5 button on the luminosity selections bar. We can see it's created a selection in that area where the pixels are the brightest in the image. And then we're just going to click the darken button. So not one of the 3 buttons over here, but the actual darken button itself. And there we go. We have a new curves adjustment layer that darkens the image only in those very brightest highlights. So we can see it's a lot more of a subtle darkening effect because it's affecting only those brightest pixels. If we wanted to brighten only the very darkest pixels in the image and not the dark half of the image, then we would select -5. So let's press -5 and then we'll press the brighten button. And we can see there, that's only brightening those very darkest areas in the foreground. Whereas if I disable that for a second and compare that to the -1, which is the dark half, and then click the brighten button, that's having a much broader brightening effect. And then selecting any one of these buttons in between the -1 and the -5 is going to give you a kind of an increasingly restrictive selection between the brightest and then going all the way down to the darkest. Now, if you want to reap the advantages of luminosity masking without having to learn all the complicated steps that you'd have to go through without my plugin, then just click the link in the description or pinned comment to go download it and install it for free.